Okay, so first things first, you need to consider like what kind of game you're making, single player or multiplayer, what genre, and then what's your target audience, and then what is your player's motivation within the game? Are they just trying to get to the end of the level? Are they trying to collect things within the level? Are they trying to solve a puzzle, explore? Is there some sort of level progression, like literal levels, or maybe they're going to just get stronger over the course of a long period of time? It's all really important to consider when designing a level because that's going to decide where your player is going to go within the level itself. So another thing that's really important is that the levels should have some sort of clear sign of progression. It's pretty obvious in a game like Mario. You start off in a very grassy, simple area, and then as the game progresses, it gets maybe colder and darker and then very hot and fiery towards the end. If you're doing something like an open world game, it's not as clear, right? It's one seamless level, but in reality, the different areas of that world still have a sense of progression. When you get towards an area towards the end of the game or somewhere where there's like a final quest, that area is going to be a lot more inhospitable than maybe the grassy area where you very first start your adventure. And there's other forms of progression besides just like a simple level, right? Not every single game follows a very simple progression, kind of like that open world strategy. A lot of the time you'll have something like a leveling system. And that's something that you want to also make sure is progressing and changing the character as you play the game as well. Difficulty curve, this is huge. There is a clear line that you want to follow when you're making a game. That line doesn't have to be perfectly within that flow zone, but you do want to try to keep it there as close as possible. So if I pull up this, so this is if a game is really, really easy. It's going to start drifting towards the boredom area, right? So you're not ramping up as fast as you should. You're ramping up too slowly, and the player's going to get very bored. They're not going to hit that state of flow that they should be in. If you do it too much to ramp up too fast, you'll hit the anxiety peak. And some games do something like this. There's some games that are very much based on being a really hard, difficult game. But just make sure you don't crank it up too much where it's like a straight up line. All right, try to keep it more towards that flow line where the player still has a very clear sense of, all right, I'm not like going to jump from a simple level where I just jump on a couple enemies to a crazy spike pit full of hundreds of traps and enemies where you're going to be struggling through it after not fully grasping the game. And that's something that you'll kind of get the hang of as you work on this activity that we're going to be doing soon. And obviously you don't want to be in both of them at the same time, right? That'd be really bad if you're constantly going between the two. You're really hard level, really easy level. That's just even more of a mess than just ramping up too fast or not ramping up enough. And then what kind of levels do you want to make? Your theme is going to largely dictate the mechanics of your level, and the level mechanics are going to largely dictate the theme. So pick one or the other first, start with that. And then try to build the other one off of what you first picked for the first one, right? So if I want to start with a theme, let's say I want to start with a winter stage, then I should pick things like maybe some sort of ice slippery mechanic, right? Or if I want to have something where the player gets burned, then I probably want to, as like a stage gimmick or mechanic, then I should probably pick a lava theme or something like that, or like a forest that's on fire. That's pretty self-explanatory, but you can be pretty creative in the ways you kind of interact with these two, or maybe mix two themes together, something like that. Okay, so this is a really cool thing called the whiteboard test. You don't have to worry, that's a lot of text, don't worry about that. The main thing I want to explain here is this is for a first-person shooter. On the far left, you have somebody who has no experience at all. They're just kind of randomly scribbling a bunch of stuff there, so that way the player has some sort of obstacles to get around. To the right of that, you have the intermediate level designer, and that person is making a lot of boxes and hallways. And the boxes and hallways are a step in the right direction, but when you're playing a shooter, you don't want to have too many hallways because you're going to be walking down the hallway one direction, people are just going to be shooting you in the back the whole time. So, a hallway or two, not a big deal, but if the whole level's just rooms and hallways, you're going to probably have some issues with that level design. The advanced one, you can see they have these gray lines in there, these really faint gray lines. And those are supposed to represent stairs. So now we're introducing the idea of elevation within the level. And then at the very end, we have the expert, where it's not all perfectly geometric, right? You don't have very clear boxy design. It's kind of more spread out. And more importantly, we have now split this building up into 2 separate rooms. Maybe it's separated by a pit in the middle, or maybe it's just a grassy outside area. And most importantly, it's very memorable, right? So we have that circular room in the corner. That's going to be a massive point of contention for people to say, okay, I need to go to this circular room because I remember where that is, and that's kind of like a point of reference, so I know where I am within the level itself. Okay, so this is going to be something that when we get to the activity part, you're not going to worry about, but I do want to talk about it really briefly because this is something that I do get asked about every once in a while, and it is something good to kind of know about. So once you have the design of your level done, assuming you have the design of your level done, you can kind of look at it from the art perspective. So from the art perspective, make sure that your color schemes blend well together. Your main character should always stand out against the background. Here in the bottom left, we have a picture from Shovel Knight, and in Shovel Knight, you can see the character is Hollow Knight. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. Shovel Knight is in this talk. I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, Hollow Knight, his head's white and it stands out a lot against the background, so it's very clear to see where the player is at all times. I'll make sure that your lighting makes sense. You have the Dark Souls picture, and you don't want Dark Souls to be a really bright, colorful game, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. The level should be very dark and gloomy in order to fit that kind of atmosphere. And then the last one, a really awesome example that I love is a game called Fez. And in Fez, the whole point of the world is to make it as like lively as possible, because you don't really die a lot in that game. It's more to just kind of stop and smell the roses, so to speak. So what they did to juice that up is they made a lot of stuff that kind of dances around in the level that you don't really interact with. It just looks nice and makes the level feel alive, and there's a lot of movement within it. From a design perspective, make things look really organic. I can't tell you how many games I've played where there's just like a very clear, like boxy structure to all the levels. It just looks like somebody slapped a bunch of squares together. The more you can make it look like something that would happen out in nature, the better. And then an organic for maybe a more industrial, like a building kind of design was like that example going back to the first-person shooter example, where the building wasn't perfectly square, it kind of like spread out for the more advanced look, and had a circular structure in it and everything like that. Don't clutter your traps mechanics. Don't like bunch everything up together in one spot. And then make your paths really clear through the level so the player can always see, okay, I can take this path, or maybe they can take an alternate path through the level. Okay, I know that was a lot. I tried to get through it as fast as possible. We're going to start getting into the activity. So as everybody sees, you got a piece of paper in front of you. What we're going to do is we're going to draw a level ourselves. So I'm going to do a quick talk about a specific aspect of a level, and then I'm going to ask everyone here to draw that piece of the level. Now here's where the challenging part comes in. I'm not going to tell you how many different things we're going to add. So you're going to probably be tight on space, so you're going to have to get creative with how you're designing your level, not knowing what you're going to have to do at the very end of the talk. So the first thing, make sure that before we get started, you know what your player wants to do movement-wise. You can choose between either a side-scrolling platforming game. That's probably the easiest one to do. You can do a top-down game like Hyper Light Drifter, Legend of Zelda, stuff like that, where it's like a 2D looking down at the world. If you want to do something in 3D, that's completely okay. Just make sure that you're drawing it from a perspective that makes sense. Don't draw it from like the first-person perspective. Make sure you're drawing it from like a top-down perspective, so that way you can tell how you're designing the level. Just know that when you do that, you can't really see as much as you would from that top-down perspective. Make sure you're paying attention to the fact that the player can only see forward in your level. But again, I wouldn't recommend that unless you're a little bit more experienced with level design. So once you have the movement kind of in your head and you've thought about it, it's time to start drafting out your level. So we're going to break it into pieces. And this is just some other stuff about gray boxing and stuff like that. Make sure that when you go to implement this level into a project, if you do decide to do that, it's kind of sectioned out and designed in the game very quickly first. Okay, so getting started, teaching the player. So does your game need a tutorial? If you're making a game like Civilization, you're going to need a very complicated tutorial, right? You got to explain what all those buttons do, all the trees do. You know, the player who sits down and plays Civilization for the first time isn't going to even know how to end their turn, right? They don't know what the heck is going on. But if you sit down and play Mario, you've got a controller probably with like 3 buttons on it, all right? So you don't have to sit there and have a 20-minute tutorial explaining that A is jump. What we're going to be doing today is expecting you that you're playing a game like Mario and that you're going to teach the player through the level. So we're going to talk about how to do that next. Also, don't do this. All right, has anybody seen this before? This is pretty popular in like the Xbox 360 days. They just throw the controller map up there and it'd be like, oh, this is what you do. Okay, the loading screen's over. All right, next thing. And then I don't know what they just said. So yeah, don't do that. So keep it simple. You don't need to get everything, right off the bat. You can kind of spread it out. Make sure everything's super duper clear, and then you can teach by doing. So on the far right, I have a couple examples of 3 different schools of design for this sort of thing. The first one is Mario. So Mario, they drop you into a level and they don't explain anything, right? You get a controller, and on the old NES, it was the D-pad and then B and A, right? So I have the D-pad, I'm mashing buttons, I press B, it doesn't really do anything, I press A and then I jump, and I realize, okay, well I can jump. And I've got this Goomba moving at me, so I know I need to go over the Goomba somehow, and I know I can jump because I was mashing buttons, so I'll naturally kind of figure that out on my own. I don't need to explain that. The one below that is the safe room idea. And the safe room idea is that you drop the player into a safe environment. There is no hazards or anything within that space. Then they can mash buttons and they don't have to worry about the Goomba coming at them. They can just kind of mess around until they get a feel of that space, and then they can leave that space on their own and they'll now have figured things out. That I wouldn't recommend for a more complicated project with a lot of controls, because there's a chance that the player might maybe miss something. Like they might not know that you can double jump. They'll just figure out that you can only jump once. For a game like this is from a game called Cave Story, if anybody's familiar with that. They don't give you something like the gun until a little bit later on. They just expect you to figure out that you can jump here, so that's okay to do that just right off the bat. Last one is Cuphead. So in Cuphead, they just lock you into a room and they have text that says, okay, A is to jump, Y is to dash, so on and so forth. And if you need to do that, that's totally okay. I would just recommend doing that as an option and not as something that's mandatory, because a lot of people will be like, okay, I've played Cuphead 5 times, I don't need to know that Y is dash. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Whereas the Mario one, you go, oh, this is level 1, this isn't a tutorial, I don't mind playing through this again, I enjoy this part. Okay, so now it's your turn. So make a few level chunks that teach how to move, at least one attack that you can do. Maybe that's just jumping on enemies, maybe that's swinging a sword, shooting a gun, etc., whatever you want it to be. And then add 2 ways, or teach 2 ways the player can get hurt. So I'll give you a hint on that last one. You don't want to teach them how to get hurt as much as you want to teach them how to not get hurt, right? So if there's a pit, you want to teach them how to jump over the pit, not how to jump into the pit. All right, time is up. Pencils down. We're moving on to the next section. Pencils down. All right, this is an exam. All right, level mechanics. Now we're on Shovel Knight. Cool. Introducing a new mechanic. So change it up. Use it when the player has a good grasp of it. Change it in subtle ways. Mix it with other mechanics, so on and so forth. And then come back to it later. So like spread it out. You don't have to teach them everything at once. This isn't a class. It's supposed to be fun. So don't overload your players either with too much information right off the get-go. So here we have an example from Shovel Knight. On the far left, you can see Shovel Knight's messing around with these rocks. Shovel Knight can figure out that when he hits one of the rocks, it flies up in the air, and he can bounce off of it. To the right of that, you can see that he then learns later on in the level that he can hit a rock even higher in the air and then use them as platforms to bounce to get to new areas. And then at the very end, Shovel Knight learns that he can combine that with another mechanic that is moving platforms to get through a newer challenge. All right, so now it's your turn again. You're going to teach two completely different level mechanics to the player. You're going to teach an additional use of each level mechanic, maybe in a separate kind of space. And then at the very end, I want you to teach a way in which the two level mechanics interact, kind of just like what we saw with the Shovel Knight example. Any questions on that? No? Okay. I'm going to give you 10 minutes on this one. All right, you ready? Start. Okay. So that is the end of that section. If you're running out of space, good. That's the point of this exercise. Hopefully you're struggling through it a little bit. We just want to have you guys have some sort of constraint, because in game development, a lot of the times, unfortunately, you don't get to do exactly what you want to. There's going to be some sort of limitation in place, whether that's some sort of knowledge limitation, you don't know how to do something. Maybe there's, you're taking up too much room in the game. You need to limit your space because you're working with a team. Some of their assets are taking up a lot of space. Whatever it is.
Don't have enough time.
That's a big one. That's a huge one. Whatever it is, you're going to have some sort of thing that you're going to have to creatively work around, and this is just another fun way of kind of representing that in this activity. Okay, going backwards. So we're going to talk about backtracking. Why is that bolded weird? I'll explain what that says. Yeah, did that happen last time?
Yeah, I did like a couple times.
Weird.
It looks fine.
Okay, so don't make it too tedious, or don't make it too easy. All right, find the fine balance. Switch things up, new mechanic layouts every single time. So if you're going through it one way, when you come back through it the other way, try to like make the level change a little bit. Right, it's not backtracking if it's entirely new, but maybe you can shift around some tiles. Maybe have some tiles that only appear when you're going backwards through the level, stuff like that. Add fast travel. If you're playing, like maybe playing through a Metroidvania game, something like that, there's usually some sort of point where you can skip from one end of the world to the other. You don't have to like walk through the whole thing. Obviously, you're gonna have to do some backtracking, but to minimize that might be better in some instances. And separate your hard parts from your backtracking sections. If you're gonna have a really challenging area, you don't want to make that the most traveled area in the game. It shouldn't be like this area where every single time I need to go to the next area, I have to go back through this hellish pit of monsters and spikes and enemies, stuff like that. And what that's supposed to say is that your players should never decide not to backtrack because it's too annoying or too difficult, or even too boring. All right? You should never have somebody say, I'm not going to go back through there and get that special item because it's just too much. There's a good way to do backtracking, and then there's obviously, as a lot of you have experienced, a very bad way to do backtracking. So for that part, you're going to add a level chunk that you can traverse forwards and backwards through, and add something that changes during the backwards traversal. So a new path, change of mechanics, maybe the enemies change in some way. You're going to have to figure out a way to fit that in to your level somewhere. If you're running out of room and you don't know where you're going to put that in at this point, you can always do something where you draw it off to the side, and then maybe when we do this next part coming up after this, you can then try to connect the two. I don't know. You're going to have to get creative with it. So give it a shot. I'm only going to give you 4 minutes for this one. Ready, start. Okay. On to the next section. If you have time, you can always go back to one of the parts you've already drawn and try to touch it up a little bit. Adding some spice. All right. Objectives. So you can have a lot of different kinds of objectives in a lot of different kinds of games. The first one is probably a side quest. That's the one that a lot of people are familiar with. You have an NPC somewhere in the level or the world or a town somewhere. You go up to them and you talk to them and they say, okay, on top of doing what you're doing, go kill a guy or something like that. And the important thing to keep in mind with any kind of objective that you implement, make sure that you know what kind of audience you're trying to set these targets for. So hardcore players want a lot of things that need a lot of knowledge and skill to do. Casual players want something straightforward like a collectible that's just kind of floating there. And then the best kind of objectives are something that you can do a little bit of both, right? So somebody that is very knowledgeable in the game can kind of speed run through and grab them all really easily, but somebody who's a casual player can still try to get through them and collect them on their own without too much trouble themselves. So the example I like to talk about is in the Sonic the Hedgehog series in the classic games. there was these giant rings you could go into. And if you collected all the Chaos Emeralds and those bonus stages that you got to with the giant rings, you had a shot at fighting the final boss, the true final boss of the game that you didn't get without getting those collectibles, right? So a casual player could play through the whole game and not even bother with those and have a great time and beat the game, no big deal. But if somebody wanted to really put the time in and try to beat those special stages, they got a shot at a special ending and a special boss to reward them for their time and effort. So that's a really good way of doing kind of that hardcore player and casual player collectible. All right, so your turn. Add a level chunk that has both a power-up of some kind, right? Because that can be some sort of thing you're looking for, some sort of objective to collect, and then also some sort of collectible. You get only 2 minutes this time. Go. And now the final one, wrap it up. So just end the level somehow. Get creative. Put a flagpole, put some sort of pit to jump into, find some sort of creative way to end your level. So a quick review of everything we went over today. Learn, play, challenge, and then surprise the player. Learn in a safe area to make sure that the player knows what they're doing without getting frustrated. Let the player play around with the fun mechanics of the level. Challenge the player when that time is appropriate. And then surprise the player and try to change their expectations.